Well, hey there, neighbor. It's a beautiful day. So, good morning, everyone. Let's take today to talk about shadow fencing. So, first off, what is shadow fencing? Shadow fencing is when it can be a couple different things. But in the case of what we're going to talk about today, it's the idea of fencing with yourself or against an imaginary opponent. So, shadow fencing can very easily just turn into you flipping the sword around, and that's not the objective of this. The objective of this is to get you to be thinking about your own personal style of movement, start predicting the likelihood of the way your opponent's going to move, and then tailoring what you're doing to both. So, for example, one of the most important skills that you can use for shadow fencing is going to be sticking to your own good stance. Okay, so for example, if you have a long reach, you should be focusing on trying to use cuts that extend the same as you would when you were fencing someone who is out at the edge of your range. If you were a shorter fighter, you should tailor in the idea of advancing under cover because you're going to have to go past that first range marker, and they're probably going to attack you first, and then staying in your comfortable distance without closing too tightly. Now, shadow fencing should be done in correspondence with Pell work, and I'm going to do a video on Pell work soon, don't worry. But it should be done in correspondence with Pell work. However, it is not quite the same because it's a little more dynamic. So with a Pell, you're moving around it. You're moving in and out of distance with it. It is a visual reference. For shadow fencing, you don't have a visual reference. You've got to make it up. So, time to put those thinking caps on and imagination and all that. So, that's the most important thing, is to make sure that you are sticking to your own respective move set. Now, it's okay to train other things, don't get me wrong, but you should be using this time to build up your own combinations, your own movement, etc. Because if you don't, well, it's just going to take longer. You need to be self-aware. You need to be thinking about, how is it that I fight, right? What is it that I do? What is it that other people do? And that's where we get into the second part, which is the imaginary opponent. You want to make sure that you're not going like we all used to when we were kids and just endlessly fighting waves of battle droids or whatever with our lightsabers in our front yard. Wow, I really haven't changed. But anyway, you want to make sure that you're keeping your engagements and your clashings realistic. You don't want to be going more than 2 moves, more than 3 moves without withdrawing. Occasionally add in some defensive movement, which is what we're going to go over in a moment. Just don't get caught up with just swinging the sword around. If you just want to swing the sword, there are flow patterns for that. Shadow boxing is meant to be a little more introspective, almost a little bit like meditation, but more violent. Now, the last thing that makes shadow fencing so important is making sure that you set into yourself from the beginning the criteria. So, for example, let's say you only know Liechtenauer. I want to work on specifically Liechtenauer stuff. Okay, well, that's a good time for you to start comboing Meisterhau together or practicing launching your Meisterhau off of movement. Let's say, for example, that you don't know any Liechtenauer, right? Or maybe you do and you're just choosing not to do it, okay? It's a good time to take a sliver of your toolbox and utilize it against different opponents. So, for example, let's say that I'm going to borrow something that Randy actually did recently. Let's say I'm Randy, and I love playing out of my Shieldhaus, and I love my point forward stuff. So I'm going to go, okay, I'm going to focus on doing thrusts and things like that, and my Shieldhaus is going to be kind of my hard hitter. Well, I need to imagine that coming in with different stimulus and different things the opponent does. So, for example, what you could end up doing is just launching Shieldhaus against every Oberhau that comes at you. But what if you start to launch your Shieldhau and your opponent tries to double hit you? This is kind of introspective, meditative stuff that I want people to start doing, right? The idea that you've started a strike and now someone is choosing to kill you both, being able to pull yourself back out of that. If you have that in your toolbox already, when it happens in sparring, you're more likely to do the right thing, which is, of course, defend yourself. As I always say, killing him is not worth dying for. So, those are kind of the conditions for shadow fencing that we're going in with, or at least my version of shadow fencing. Now, the next important thing is making sure that you have enough room, okay? You do need to be moving around, okay? So, doing this in your driveway, doing this, somewhere outdoors is a good idea, or if you have a largish living room, whatever. Make sure that you are definitely staying away from light fixtures, because when you're focused on things up here, you forget about everything out here. Most of the stuff I've shown you so far you could do inside, but for this one has the high likelihood of accidentally nicking a bystander. So that's another thing. If you're shadow fencing, keep your eyes open. Don't close them, okay? All right, so let's go over some basic ideas. So firstly, as we can see, I've got my space here. Number one, we're gonna focus on movement. What I recommend you do is you do 3 rounds for shadow fencing. Each one should last about 2 minutes, 3 minutes, right? And you rest in between for about a minute. So, let's say I'm gonna do my first 2-minute round, and it's going to be mostly focused on movement. So, I'm going to be moving around, keeping my eye on my opponent, changing up guards, moving in and out of distance. I'm keeping it fluid, and I'm picturing them doing different things. Now, at the moment, I'm only focused on one opponent, and I'm keeping my eyes on him, and I'm keeping myself lined up in relation to him, okay? Keep your steps small. Try to work your guard transitions in with your stepping. So something I like to do, for example, is if I know I need to step back out of Vom Tag, I'll step back into Langenort, then I'll drop down to Flug, and advance back into right Flug. Those kinds of things. Now that's passive sort of guard transition. You can also start adding in the idea of I cut into my guard, right? I'm cutting back up, going into a Zwerk to get into my Ox, things like that. That's another thing you can start doing. So I'm just moving around with my opponent, keeping distance with them, moving in and out. Another good thing to do is to picture them doing certain guards. Take a counter guard. So someone takes a low guard, take a high guard. Someone takes a point forward guard. Back up and prepare to enter in strongly against that point forward. They are pulling back away from you. Get that point forward and chase them, okay? Things like that. So you do that for about 2-3-ish minutes. Then, rest from it, come back. Now we're going to start actually fencing with our opponent. So this one, again, I'm only thinking about the solitary opponent, but I'm now going to start throwing strikes at them, and I'm also going to be defending myself. Like I said, we're not going to end up in, and I cut him, and then I cut him again, and I chop down, and then there's Buddy, and I stab him, right? We're not worried about that. That's for the movies. We're worried about active defense and making sure that we are being realistic. So, I'm moving with my opponent, right? I'm staying up, I'm staying light, I'm staying airy. And then I see my opening, I launch my strike, maybe it succeeds, maybe it doesn't. I withdraw, and I'm back into movement, okay? Now, I froze for sake of explaining it, and realistically, it should look like this. I'm moving with my opponent, life is great, life is grand, boom, boom, there's my opener, get out, back into it, okay? And I just keep flowing, and start practicing throwing cuts from different guards. For example, I threw a Shielhau out of Flug. I stepped in with a Zwerk, launched a second Zwerk, folded out of it, etc. These are the kinds of movements you want to be doing. Now, how do you defend yourself, right? That's the tricky bit. How do you defend against something that's not there? Well, you can do it in a couple different ways. So number one, we don't want to be doing blocks if we can help it, but blocks against the air don't really teach you anything. Instead, this is the time to use good parries, right? And remember, a good parry is basically just a cut. So, for example, I'm moving here, my opponent steps in, I wasn't ready for it, I cut down, thrust, and I stay on the blade until I'm at a distance, right? Someone attacks me, set it aside, cut. Things of that nature, right? Always think about cutting with your defense. So here comes that cut in, I'm gonna use my short edge to set it aside, then I'm gonna respond with a cut, or someone's cutting at me, I'm going to meet them in a bind, step forward to the thrust, maybe that thrust didn't hit, take off, leave, etc. Make sense? So, do that for about 3-ish minutes. You don't have to do it as fast as I'm doing it. Heck, actually, I'm doing it relatively slow. But you don't have to do it super quick. It can be slow. It can be, like I said, meditative, right? Things of that nature. And make sure that you're keeping your good form. Now, I'm doing it barefoot on my driveway, which is quite fun because I have to really make sure that I'm stepping correctly, or it hurts. I don't recommend everyone do it, but I recommend trying it at least a couple times. You never get the chance to train outside of your shoes at the school normally, unless you're doing ringing. Learn what your feet actually do, you know? I'm here, I'm not going to stamp my foot down, that's going to hurt. I'm going to be light and airy, etc. So, these are things to try. So that's our second round. Let me rest. What's our third round going to be? The third round is where we start trying to think about multiple opponents. Now, obviously, in a multiple opponent scenario, we know how it's going to go. They're going to knock you down and kick you in the corner, but we can still train under it. What this is really meant to do is to start getting you thinking in a 360-degree plane. So, something that doesn't necessarily come up a whole lot is I'm fencing one guy, and now there's something behind me. How do I go from this position to facing that way? There's a couple different ways. I can turn, right? What have you. I could step out entirely to fence both, but then you've got two opponents. You want to fence kind of one at a time, but you want to keep your movement dynamic. So this is what the fencing multiple opponents does, and this is something I especially recommend you do slower. So in this case, I'm going to imagine I have 3 opponents, but they're going to stagger their approach in. So first opponent, second opponent, third opponent. That means I must imagine what they're throwing at me. So I'm going to start out here. First opponent's come in, boom, thrust, catch, cut, okay. Last opponent's coming in, I set myself, boom, we're back out. Now, was that all imaginary? Yes. But in my mind, I've pictured exactly what happened. First guy came in with his point forward, I met it, I extended and thrust. Second guy came forward with his cut, I stepped out to parry it, I cut at him with my normal snap cut. Third guy was a little bit behind them, so I set myself down into guard. He cuts in, I defend, I attack. That's the kind of thing I want you picturing, right? Now, it does start to get a little bit complicated and can seem a little bit bewildering for a newer person. It's like, okay, well, you know, I only know like 4 cuts. Well, think about those 4 cuts in different angles, right? For example, this guy comes forward with an Unterhau instead, and I was here. Okay, I'm now going to set myself down low. Maybe I want to start my thrust, but if he did an Unterhau, he's probably going to follow through with an Oberhaus, so I'm going to catch it and thrust, right? Those kinds of ideas. Or maybe you end up on the back foot, right? So I've dealt with this guy's come in, and he's kind of caught me in an off-balance position. This can happen dynamically. Think about instead, okay, I'm going to get rid of his blade and step all the way back I can before coming back in. Things like that. Take it slower and enjoy it, right? It's fun. It's a really fun mental exercise. It's also good physically. The last thing I want to talk about is make yourself big. Make yourself as big as you can, unless you're training indoors. But even then, that's why I said this is best done outdoors. Make sure that you are idealized fencing. So I'm not going to be down here or here, but I'm going to be up. My posture is going to be up. I'm going to do full unrestricted cuts because I can and I should, right? And focus on your own balance. Especially when you're swinging at a person, it's very easy to end up in an off-balance position, get that hit, and then stumble out of it. When you're going against air, you'll notice pretty quickly when you're falling down the stairs, right, Eric? But, so that's the third round. You don't necessarily have to do this every day, but it's a good thing to do at least, 3 times a week or so. That's what I plan on doing. But that's how to shadow fence. And you can tailor it to however you want to be. So you can also say, okay, well, I'm going to mostly focus on thrusts with only occasional cuts. So I'm going to cut to thrusts, or I'm going to parry and then thrust, or I'm going to thrust and then wind to defend myself and leave, right? You could say I'm only going to throw cuts to open and then it's going to be all blade work, or things like that. Or you could say, hey, I'm going to fence left foot forward as much as I can, right? Things like that. So you can add your own conditioning. And the more you know about opponents, etc., the more complicated you can make it. But even as a beginner, it's a very valuable thing to know how to do. So, last little bit of advice I would say is, okay, I don't like doing it in silence. I don't like my violence in silence. Well, first off, but if you enjoy musical accompaniment to you doing this kind of thing, then some recommended tracks for you. Yeah, who would have guessed that I have a musical track? I recommend Solomon Kane, the soundtrack. Cloak and Dagger is the song. There's an extended version on YouTube. That's the one I actually came up with Krumpschilunter's work to. I recommend Glory Seeker by, I think it's Audio Machine. I recommend, let's see, the Skyrim main theme isn't bad. Yeah, those are the kinds of things that I recommend, right? Find music that has a nice, not necessarily fast, but decently paced rhythm that allows you to kind of follow it. That'll give you your own sort of pace if you're one of those people. Because initially, like me, I liked to have musical accompaniment. Now I'm a little more comfortable with the silence in my head. But if you need something to get you into that mood, that's a good thing. But make sure that it is something that is continuous, right? Or has a continuous bit and then a rest. That's also very good. That's one of the reasons I really recommend Cloak and Dagger, is because it has a little, I'm bad with musical terms, but it has its bit and then it rests and then its bit starts up again, which is good for where action, withdraw, come back in. So those are some of the musical tracks I recommend. I'll be throwing some more up here and there as I think of them. But either way, that is how to Shadowfence. I hope you're all keeping up with your workouts and your fitness and you're staying healthy and staying at home and all that good stuff. But we'll talk about some more techniques another time.